Good Shabbos. This week's portion is Parshas Miketz, and the parsha tells us about Yosef's rise to power, and then it tells us the story about his interaction with his brothers when his brothers come down to Egypt during the famine, and they don't recognize him, and he recognizes them and how he treats them. There's just one small section that I want to talk about, though, which is Yosef's children and the names that his children have. So after he rises to power, Paro gives him a wife, Osnas bas Potiphera Kohen On, Osnas the daughter of Potiphera, who is a priest of On, and he has two children, and he calls the name of the Bechar, the firstborn, Menashe. Why? Kinashani Elohim es kol amali ves kol beis avi. Because God has allowed me to forget all my hardship and all my father's household. And then he has a second son, and he calls his name Ephraim, Ki Ephrani Elokim be'eretz ani, because God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering. What's very interesting is later on, when Yaakov gives blessings to Yosef's two sons when he's ready to die, he switches the order of Ephraim and Manasseh. And he says that Ephraim, even though he's the second born son, he will be the one who's listed first, who's mentioned first. And even though Manasseh is the Bechar, even though Manasseh is the firstborn. Again, this is a pattern which goes throughout the stories of Bereshis, where the younger son is chosen over the older son. But I think here there might be another message, possibly. And the message is, what did you name your son? What were you thinking? What do they represent? What do they symbolize? What kind of message are you promoting to yourself, to your family, and to your children? And the message here is that Yosef was upset with what happened, which is fair. They wanted to kill him, his brothers. They put him in a pit. They sold him as a slave. He was a prisoner in Egypt. He went through tremendous hardships. But what he says is, God has allowed me to forget all my hardships, but then he says to forget all of my father's household. And you could imagine Yaakov years later saying, you wanted to forget your father's household? You might want to interpret this just to forget the hardships in my father's household, but that's not what he says. And his actions later on seem to tell us that that's not what he meant. Because after he becomes a viceroy and a very important person in Egypt for many years, for over at least 7 years of the time, the good times of when there's a lot of good harvests, he doesn't, as many commentaries say and ask, he doesn't contact his father. He doesn't call home. He doesn't send a message, which he easily could have done. So it becomes apparent that he wasn't just forgetting the hardships. He was also forgetting his father's household, because, and it's almost understandable, all the terrible things that went on, and it was maybe just better to move forward. But he's forgetting his father also, and he might be blaming his father for all we know. But he wasn't willing to sort of push that aside and forget it, and then go back to his parents, his father, I should say, and his family, but rather he wants to forget it completely. And Yaakov might be saying, no, this is not good. We have to be positive. We can't forget your father's household. You have to be part of our family. He then takes Ephraim and Manasseh, and he says they're almost like my children. Reuven and Shimon, they should be like Reuven and Shimon, my other two sons. I'm treating them as my own. I want you back in the family. So that's a very important message. But what was Yosef really thinking? He was saying, I want to forget my suffering. And in a way, that's really good. How do we deal with suffering? One way to deal with suffering is to forget it, to push it out. And that's positive. Push it out. And then the next time you say, now I'm going to be thankful for the good that I have. But the issue is, how do you forget? Do you forget by saying, I don't want to pay attention to anything about my father's household, both the good and the bad, because it just dredges up too many horrible memories for me? Or do you say, no, I'm going to forget the bad, but remember the good? Call home after a while, after you get it out of your system, and then you don't have to forget your father's household. Yosef perhaps was not doing that, and perhaps that's the criticism that Yaakov has about Yosef. that he wasn't able to sort of push out the bad and keep the good. And I would be remiss if I don't mention this past week's passing of Victor Fineberg, who was the president of the shul. And I would say that, in a way, he epitomized this ability to forget the bad and remember the good, to be able to push away some of the hardships that he had in life, some of the difficulties, and to be able to move on and not necessarily to throw away everything associated with that hardship, but rather to once again embrace it and just focus on the good. It's a difficult thing to do. I believe that Victor was able to do it, and I admire him, and I will always remember that as a quality that he had and something that I could learn from. And I believe it's something that we could all learn from. We must be able to forget the hardships. We must, and I'm not just talking about specific things that happen, whether it's illness or problems in business, but as far as we're all concerned, we have to think of family, friends, who sometimes we get into a difficult situation with. The question is if we're able to forget as kol amali, the hardship, but not to forget kol beis avi, but not to forget your father's house, not to forget your family, not to forget your friends, to be able to somehow reconcile with them and push away only the negative and embrace the positive. That's hopefully the message that we could learn from Yaakov's sort of criticism of Yosef. We could also learn from Victor. Olav Hashalom, may he rest in peace. Good job.